All right, a couple of pieces of housekeeping. We are providing translation between English and Spanish, so please choose the language you'd prefer using the interpretation feature in the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please also introduce yourself in the chat, but use the Q&A feature for questions that will help us to facilitate Q&A at the end of our program. With that aside, welcome to our pop-up webinar on the importance of SNAP and federal food assistance programs that we're doing together with the ELCA and Maison. I am Alan Yarborough, the Director of Government Relations and Global Partnerships for the Episcopal Church, and it is truly a pleasure to be here with our panelists and speakers today. Just a great group of people doing amazing ministry across the country. During regular times, but also particularly during this government shutdown. So we often talk about how many aspects of our lives are political, meaning they are impacted by decisions from our federal, state, and local governments, even if those decisions impact us in different ways, sometimes in ways we may not be aware of. So I think the more honest we are about the connections between direct action, like donating to a food bank, and advocacy for better policy and legislation, the better equipped we will be to identify and respond to challenges in our communities. So today's program is in the context of the government shutdown. It is a chance to explore a topic, food and food assistance, that many may be familiar with from the perspective of a food bank or preparing meals for the homeless, but less familiar perhaps from the perspective of federally funded food assistance. Despite comprising less than 2% of all federal spending, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, serves over 40 million people a year. Of those, 39% are children, another 20% are over 60. These are members of our communities from all walks of life, children, veterans, unhoused people, the elderly, and more. 79%, so about 80% of households with SNAP recipients have either a child, an elderly individual, or non-elderly individual with a disability living in the household. This year, we've seen major changes to the program, primarily from HR 1, which adds work requirements for previously exempted groups and has states cost share based on an error rate for the first time. Additionally, while the federal government has tracked food insecurity since 1995, the Trump administration announced that it would cancel the USDA annual food insecurity survey. The government shutdown also has added an immense layer of complications, delaying benefits for millions. Churches continue to advocate and engage on housing, healthcare, nutrition, and this program will focus on the food pieces from SNAP to the special supplemental nutrition program for women, infants, and children, and other programs that make that possible or make that response possible. We'll also talk about why churches are there to support, but can't shoulder the full burden that this government funding fills. Advocacy and academic organizations who specialize in this work underscore that federal assistance is essential. According to Bread for the World, federal nutrition programs provide 10 times as much food assistance as private churches and charities combined. So while direct work that faith institutions do is critical, and we will hear some amazing examples today, this means churches and nonprofits can't fill the space left by the lapse in funding. It takes both intentional public funding and your individual efforts to address hunger in our communities. And I hope today's program, despite the heavy climate, inspires you to do more and keep going with this important work. So part one, we will focus on engagement from the ground and then shift in part two to a policy context from the federal level. So really excited to get our first segment underway here. I want to introduce our speakers, Bishop Hyde from the Diocese of New York, Bishop Monette and Reverend Lizzie Gilman from the Episcopal Diocese of Iowa. So welcome to the three of you. Really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for doing this, Alan. Thanks for sponsoring. It's really important.
Thank you for having us. Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So, in no particular order here, I have some background and understanding of what your respective contexts have done. One that is primarily urban, but with some rural and agriculture regions. The other from a state that's known for agriculture, but has a lot of small towns. And so really am curious, just in a fairly straightforward way, how has your diocese responded to the events of recent weeks? What are you seeing on the ground? Bishop Hyde, we'll start with you.
Well, we are in the midst of doing four things. Um, the first is helping frame where we are as a moral crisis. I mean, there's so much going on in our world and so many confusing things and news alerts all the time about all kinds of things happening. And to be really clear from the perspective of our faith, from the gospel, that what's happening in all of our neighborhoods is a moral crisis and responds to the very substance of our faith. And we think that's been helpful to be able to share it in that way. The second is to be able to focus locally. We have food pantries and soup kitchens in every part of the Diocese of New York, as we do across the Episcopal Church. And our folks open the doors every single day. It's amazing. And in the last year, especially around questions of immigration and sanctuary, have done even more. Already, before the shutdown, folks were seeing a decrease in food. And so our food pantries, who've been in the ministry for 4 decades, for the first time are having to ration food. This comes out of the bill this summer. And so our folks are trying to respond and trying to do more and listen very carefully to the needs of their communities. And we want to help them do more. And that's what we've tried to do. We come back to that in a moment. The third is to reach out. We can't do this by ourselves. We try to reach out across sectors. The long-term decrease in funding, the long-term policy changes, unfortunately, will long outlast the shutdown, as troubling as the shutdown has been. So
Right.
we need to work with others, business community, nonprofit community, philanthropic community across the state. We were part of the governor's announcement of a food emergency and grateful to have been part of that moment. And final is advocacy. For folks, we are New York State is a blue state, but we are deeply red and blue across the Diocese of New York. And so it doesn't matter what party your elected representatives are, doesn't matter who you yourself vote for. Food is not a bargaining chip. Food is dignity and food is life. And so to be able to be very clear in calling our elected representatives and engaging them in this process and having them not be distracted is really important. You mentioned the numbers nationally within New York. 3 million folks are on SNAP, 1 million kids, 600,000 seniors, $650 million a month comes to SNAP. And so I want to underline twice, Alan, what you said. Our folks are doing more. We have tried to step forward as a diocese. Episcopal Charities in the diocese has been active in trying to make micro grants back to our feeding programs to help respond. At the cathedral, I want to call out the leadership, both in all areas, in framing this, in responding directly, and advocacy for the dean of our cathedral, Winnie Varghese. The cathedral has been magnificent with this, and still nobody can fill the gap that $650 million a month leaves for people in our neighborhoods. And so
Right.
grateful to be able to work together across the whole church. It's been an important time at this moment for church to be church. And that'll continue to be the case as we work through shutdown. We hope, I mean, our folks are still not getting SNAP payments. And so the crisis is still immediately here. And there's a lot of, a lot of need to continue responding to on a long-term basis once the shutdown ends.
Thank you for providing that the moral framing and a bit of detail about how the Diocese of New York is responding. And we'll our second set of conversation here in a moment will speak a bit more to the way that this issue has been supported and engaged in by Republicans and Democrats both historically and what that sort of looks like now. Bishop Mana and Reverend Lizzie, I'll turn it to you two to speak to the context in Iowa.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And thank you, Bishop Haid. That was everything you said. Yes, moral framing is so important at this time. So, the Diocese of Iowa is a very rural diocese. We are the whole state of Iowa, and there are 53 congregations across the state. So we are widely dispersed and an agricultural state, right? So one thing about farmers is that they are very, very practical people. So folks across our congregations, many of our congregations have direct feeding ministries. Either it's the food pantry style or it's a meal program. And all of them have been stepping up as the needs been increasing. I've seen lots and lots of increased call for donations for food pantries or food ministries. In addition, I have been just on a diocesan level, collecting information from those congregations specifically about what is the need in your particular ministry, so that I, from Bishop's Discretionary Fund, am able to help just in a very practical manner. I know that food donations are always great and cash is always appreciated. So that's the specifics with what I've been what our diocese has been doing. But I know if you want to hear some stories from Lizzie, she is one of our heroes along these lines.
Well, thank you, Bishop. I don't know if I would call myself that, but certainly boots on the ground. So I am the priest in charge at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Des Moines. And at our church, we host the St. Andrew's Market, which is our community fridge. It is located on our church property and open 24/7 for anyone to leave what they can and take what they need. The members of our congregation join with other congregations to repack hundreds of pounds of rescued food each week into smaller portions, and then we restock community fridges in churches across the city. Throughout the week, the market is sustained by a network of partners. So we have mutual aid groups, food rescue organizations, the Faith and Grace Garden at St. Timothy's Episcopal Church, schools, businesses, and families and individuals who drop off donations whenever they can. We also have a memorial fund in honor of Deacon Eve Marr, and this is where members can sign up to purchase a certain amount of protein each week, and then they'll be reimbursed from that fund. So we see our most marginalized neighbors, and we get to know a lot of them who come to the St. Andrew's Market for food. We see families with young children, we see the elderly, we see people who are cooking for the elderly, we see the unhoused, refugees, immigrants, teens after school, grandparents raising grandchildren, neighbors looking out for each other. The list really does go on. But we're seeing more and more faces these days, as well as neighbors who are coming back more often. Because I mentioned that we do get a lot of food for the community fridge, but what's important to understand is that not everybody comes and finds food when they come to the community fridge, because the need is just so great. So folks do come multiple times a day in hopes to find something that they can and will eat.
Yeah, thanks for speaking to that. And you know, the reality is we've been talking in media lately, at least it's been about SNAP recipients and that federal funding coming through, but there's a lot of other dimensions to food access, food distribution, those who are in need. It's not just about those who are eligible for SNAP or for WIC. It's also those who aren't, and how are we able to, as churches, step in? Um, Given we're doing this in partnership with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, we have Maison on as a speaker in a moment. There are a lot of ecumenical and interfaith examples of engagement here. I know it wasn't a question that we sort of prepared, but I imagine you all would be able to speak to that. I'd love to hear a bit more about how you're each collaborating with other churches, other faith groups.
If I could take that real quick because
Sure.
we do that every Friday. We go to New Beginnings Christian Church. They have this beautiful setup for us where we package these individual meals that are we rescue food from the Iowa Event Center. So the biggest event center in our state. Whenever there is any catering, we get a couple of days worth. Sometimes they over order ingredients. So one week we had so many potatoes and leeks. It was soup season, right? So people came and got it and went home and made soup and put it in the fridge, and it was great. But we do this in partnership, and we have community fridges throughout Des Moines that are hosted by churches. And so we have a network of churches with community fridges where now they all operate a little differently, but they are all able to be stocked on the same day with the same people.
One of the things to note is that we've been able to respond because the commitment was already there and the relationships were already there. And so what we see across New York is undoubtedly across Iowa and the whole church is these wonderful deep neighborhood relationships that faith communities have with each other, that you have with local nonprofits, really are even more important at this time. Mount Kisco Interfaith Food Pantry, which is co-sponsored and was started by the Episcopal Church in Mount Kisco, New York, Westchester County, alongside other faith communities, has done magnificent work this year. And that's possible because they've been doing this for years before. And this is one of the gifts of being church, is that we are rooted in our neighborhoods. We're working for relationships all the time. And exactly the time when those are needed more, we're the places people can trust. And building up these relationships, at least in New York, which don't really exist other places, has been an important part of responding now, but an important part of our everyday life as church.
And if I could just add a little bit, one of the most wonderful things about having the ecumenical partnerships is that it makes it possible to be involved with feeding your neighbors, even if you're just a tiny, tiny little congregation. So there are examples all across the Diocese of Iowa in larger and smaller congregations, but one of them is just a tiny congregation in Sheraton, Iowa. And the child hunger rate there is 20% of food insecurity in that particular county. And the congregation there has partnered with all of the others in their ministerial association, has been doing this for years, to create this amazing food bank that provides groceries for the folks who come there. And I think that the key that I really wanted to emphasize is that it's not about whether you're a big church or a small church. You can do these things when you have those connections, because together we're so much more than we are apart. And that's just one example, one additional example of that kind of incredible work when we have those connections and when we join together.
I find these examples really inspiring and encouraging, and for quite some time we hear so many examples of division and broken relationship, and certainly this is in the face of great need that we wish were not there, but to hear about relationship building and relying on presence in communities, working across denominations and faith groups is encouraging, and to in covering our advocacy work here in DC, talk about so many different issues, and any one of our parishes is not going to be able to solve every single one of them. And so I think one of the important questions we often remind people of is, what is your unique value add? Maybe you don't have a large physical space where people can gather. Maybe you don't have a lot of funding. But what is your value add to this? There are others out here working on it. If you are not already connected, to try to seek them out, connect with them. And even if it is just bringing a small group of volunteers, or organizing a particular type of donation drive, there is value to that engagement. And I think that's something that folks hopefully relieve some of the pressure or intimidation for those who aren't as involved right now. That there really is an opportunity to step into something and make a difference. We'll hopefully leave today's program looking forward, that there is a longer timeline other than just the government shutdown potentially wrapping up in the next couple of days. That doesn't suddenly eliminate the food need. So I want to ask a question of looking back. Um, Engaging in food insecurity is not new, I imagine, for either New York or Iowa. It's not a recent phenomenon from the US government either. This is just a moment where a persistent issue is in the headlines. So I'm wondering if you all could speak to how you've seen food ministry change over the last few years, not just in this specific moment.
I can start again. So we have a really rough estimate on who comes and visits the shed, and we can kind of measure that by how many times I say the shed, the market, which is located in a shed with a community refrigerator. So if I mix up my terminology, I'm sorry right now. But so we saw a big increase in the summer of 2024 when our governor, during the summer, decided to do away with the the summer EBT program and pass out food boxes in limited locations across the state. So it wasn't the most accessible way to get food, and truth be told, we received many of the salted meats and sun butter sandwiches that came in those boxes in the community fridge because those kids aren't eating that food, I guess. And so we saw a big uptick. On an average week, we'd probably have the door opens between 1,500 and 2,000 times. And that's for donation, people, coming, going, donations, and people receiving food. And we're over double that now. And we may see that number triple just from the start of November. We've seen that skyrocket, but we saw that really big increase when families didn't have the access to summer feeding programs that they usually have.
I think it's probably everywhere that the numbers simply keep rising, and in Iowa, 12% of Iowans are food insecure, which means at over 16% of Iowa children. So 1 in 6 children in Iowa experience food insecurity. And it's one of these things where you would think, because Iowa is such an agricultural state, it's all about farming, that we would be able to do a good job of keeping people fed. Instead, all of the reliance on all of these ministries and other kinds of food services has been increasing over the years. One thing that has, this I think surprises folks about Iowa, is that Iowa has a pretty significant refugee and immigrant population. We're actually number 13 in the nation for refugee arrivals per capita here in this state. And about 6%, almost 6% of our population is foreign born, so immigrants of different kinds. But not all refugees, but not all of them hold green cards. And one of the things that kind of slid in the 2025 big tax and spending bill, HR 1, I think you were calling it, requires refugees and other immigrants to be on a green card in order to receive SNAP benefits. And not all refugees or immigrants are on green cards, and therefore that increase that we have seen that across this state.
We've seen the same thing. Increased numbers. We had about 200,000 asylum seekers join us in the last 18 months. And in every part of the diocese, not just New York City, but Wappingers Falls and in southern Dutchess County, the lines just got longer. And it's both more people and fewer places folks can trust, as Bishop Minot just said. And so being a place that people can come and feel safe has become even more important. In New York, as across the country, not only access to food has become more problematic, but rents are rising. And it ends up when people have to choose between paying the rent and buying food. And finding food in the community is easier than finding rent money. And so in places where they can no longer afford to live, folks are coming to food pantries because it gives them a way to afford unaffordable rent and still feed their family.
Thank you all for adding additional detail and context to this, and especially with immigrant communities that are also in need, and certainly there's sensitivities around that, right? And even our ability to speak to that in great detail to keep people secure. I wanted to ask if you each have a particular story from this work. That can be about an individual that was served, it can be about a volunteer, personal experience you have. But would love to hear a particular story of engagement from the food ministry. Whoever feels able to answer that first, please jump in.
I'm sorry, just jumping in.
Go ahead, yeah.
I I absolutely love my community and the people that come by. So last weekend, we observed All Saints on Sunday, and as I was preparing for the service and doing the last minute things that I do on my computer, I got a text from our altar and member from our altar guild that said, could you come help me straighten the altar frontal? It's a two-person job. So I get up and I help her. And I should tell you that we don't receive too many calls about the St. Andrew's Market. It's kind of in its own place, maybe a call or two a week. But when I came back to my desk, I had 4 messages. I was gone for maybe 10 minutes and I had 4 messages. There's no food out here. And then one person, I recognized her voice and she said, Pastor Lizzie, there's no food out here and the bus is coming in 10 minutes. And so the building wasn't open yet. So I went outside and I know Syria well, and we were able to chat. And we have some members who give little grocery card gift cards. So in an off chance, which the fridge is often empty, if I'm available, I can hand a card. So I was able to hand Syria a card, and then she just ran to the bus stop and says what she always says: I love you, I love my church, but I have to go. And she ran and caught her bus. So I know that churches are making a really big impact. And as a good friend of mine says all of the time, it's those small acts that make a big impact.
I can add a little story that from this past Sunday. So this last weekend was our convention, and closing Eucharist was at the cathedral on Sunday morning. And I walked in. Of course, you can imagine my mind was on all kinds of other things. But I walked past one of the rooms and noticed on the way in, there's the volunteers are there making the sandwiches that they are going to be bringing to the Connection Cafe, which is an organization run by a group of downtown churches here in Des Moines. And they always make the sandwiches for Monday. So they were there doing that. And I thought, oh, that's great. Making the sandwiches, very good. And then it was after worship and after everybody else had already come out of the church, and so this was a while after worship was concluded that I walked past that same room again. Some of the same people were in there, but they had gathered all these other folks who were from across the diocese, who had, been attending worship at the cathedral that morning, who were all there together, sharing around the table, making the sandwiches and talking with each other. And what it was this beautiful illustration of both community around that table and then extending that community out into the world to feed the folks in need, and of course all of it coming from the Eucharistic table. It's just this beautiful moment of this is what church is all about.
Last week I got to be in Sullivan County, which is a more rural part of the diocese, but the poverty rates and the food insecurity rates rival our most urban areas. And I've got to go. St. John's Church in Monticello has had a food pantry for, more than 20 years, run by its volunteers. And so we got a chance to visit last week. And walk in, and the first thing is that the shelves were empty. They had a big food delivery that day, and immediately everything they had was needed by people who came. And so these amazing volunteers, one retired NYPD police officer who now bilingual and is helping with the community that's becoming ever more diverse, a former administrator for the county, and the warden and a couple other folks are trying to figure out what they do. They're trying to figure out where to find food for the people whom they know, people whose names and stories they've come to know over years. And so they're driving like 60 miles to get meat. And in New York, I mean, looking across our church, that geographic distance represents different things in different parts of the Episcopal Church. For us, that's kind of a long way to go to get meat. But they're trying to figure out, be incredibly innovative, incredibly creative, because they see and know the people they serve. And as more folks come, as they're having more difficulty, they're going to try to figure it out. And I know that happens in every part of our diocese, every part of the church, but this incredible faithfulness in the face of increasing difficulty is, I find, incredibly inspirational.
Thank you for sharing these stories. The personal aspect of this, I know for the folks here in DC working in policy, sometimes, we're in meetings and safe offices and talking to people sort of at large scale areas. But again, it's such a helpful reminder for me in this moment to just hear the personal connections, the personal stories here. Before we sort of transition to the next segment, sort of a general question, what else would you each like people to know about what it means to serve in this moment, what it means to engage in community work, especially as it relates to food? You've covered a lot of ground already, so I know there may be a few things left.
I can go first again. Why not? So one thing that I would like to say is that I want people to know that churches with feeding ministries, we are doing the best that we can to meet our communities in the best ways that we know how with the amount of people that we have. So recently there's been a social experiment circulating online where a woman calls churches asking for baby formula, and there's a sound of a crying baby in the background. And she takes a tally as to who is able to give her formula, who says yes, and who says no. And it's a powerful reminder and honestly a bit of a wake-up call for all of us in faith communities to reflect on how we're responding in these moments of needs. It challenges churches to ask, how are we showing up for our neighbors during ongoing times of crisis? Are we connected to organizations to meet immediate needs? Where can we send people if we don't have what they're asking for? And at St. Andrews, we have had to wrestle with some of these same questions, and we've realized that the need in our community is really greater than what our small congregation can do on its own. And so that's why we're practicing being good neighbors and letting ourselves be neighbored, as we learned from the Genesis Project. It's why we moved the St. Andrews Market and sustained it on our property because it's not a solo effort. And so if we can share our spaces with others who are doing great things, let's do that. It becomes a collaboration between congregations, but also our schools and mutual aid groups and our neighbors who really want to help out. We do have neighbors in our community who want to help but don't know how. And so just centering our language around food access and treating each other with, well, respecting the dignity of our neighbors is paramount to what we do. And we live in a world where others want to do the same thing. They just need an avenue, and they might need someone from the church to come say, hey, let's do this work together.
Yeah, thank you for that.
I would encourage a couple of different things, and for folks. One of them is to remember that as we are stepping up to donate to our local ministry, whatever that might be, whatever the organization it is. I think I mentioned this before, it's one thing to donate some actual food. If we have money, that's always much more useful, right? Because frequently our food programs can get food at discounted rates, or they know what it is that they need. Maybe this particular area needs this kind of food, or this area doesn't need that kind of food. So money is always really good. But the other thing is advocacy. And I think it's just so important, especially right now, in this time in our country, where the rise of Christian nationalism is co-opting so much of Christian language, that our members of Congress and our state houses and whoever it is, right, that they hear this message from an explicitly Christian perspective, right? And nobody can deny Jesus was all about feeding people, right? And I'm not going to go into the sermon here, but it was without means testing. It was without, are you worthy in some way or not? And it wasn't about like, well, you can have this food, but not that food. Jesus wanted people to be fed. When we have folks who claim to be following Christianity as a spiritual path and yet are refusing to feed people, they need to be called out. They need to be reminded.
Well, first, amen to that. 100% right. Two things. One, I just want to call out again, and she was unable to join us today, but Dean Winnie Verghese and our cathedral, as we work across the diocese, really grateful for the leadership, the very visible leadership of our cathedral to step forward and really draw this city together around New York City together around this question and the moral framing of the question. Terrific leadership. What we do is deeply incarnational. And so right now we're responding even more fully to needs for food because that's what folks are coming to us with. As we continue along this path together to both see the needs and opportunities of the people who come to our front doors, seeking to be seen and seeking things they can't find any other place, and also the people who want to volunteer, who have incredible gifts, and to help them find the way that we match together the gifts and needs of our people by seeing Christ in every person, I think is an amazing opportunity for us, and a good way for us to reach out, well beyond our church to interfaith ecumenical partners, but everybody else too, and make human dignity something we hold up and call out in this moment. And with all this happening, I think that can be transformational for our neighborhoods and for our wider civic fabric.
Thank you to all three of you for this. Really appreciate it. We will switch to our second segment and then come back with everybody together for a brief Q&A. As a reminder, please use the Q&A for those attending. Please use the Q&A feature in the bottom of Zoom. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Lindsay Delks, our policy advisor for U.S. domestic policy. So, Lindsay, over to you.
Thank you so much, Alan, and great to be with everyone. As Alan mentioned, my name is Lindsay Delks, and I'm the Domestic Policy Advisor for the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations. And I am so glad to hear Bishop Hyde kind of end on the note of interfaith and ecumenical partners, even though that was resounding throughout the conversation, because we, in my role, I have the incredible opportunity to work with some of our interfaith and ecumenical partners that we have with us today. First, we have Sammy Goldsmith, who is the Deputy Director of Public Policy with Mazone, a Jewish Response to Hunger. And we also have Andrew Fuller, who is the Program Director for Economic Policy at the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. Once again, great to have both of you here as we kind of go through more of the policy side. So I want to first start off by asking both of you, what are some basics about SNAP and the program itself that everyone should know, from things like the scale of its impact, the effectiveness of the program, who benefits, and just anything you'd like to share.
Well, thank you so much, Lindsay. I can jump in, Andrew. First to say, amen to everything that was already said on this call. It is such an honor and a pleasure to be on with partners and friends. Again, I'm Sammy Goldsmith, Deputy Director of Public Policy here at Mazon, a Jewish Response to Hunger. For those who might not know us, we are a 40-year-old organization as of this year, focused on partnership grants for advocacy, as well as federal and statewide advocacy. I am responsible for the former here in Washington, D.C., but home for me is originally from the Detroit area, so shout out to the Michiganders in the chat. Lindsay, to your question, I'll just kick us off by saying I think that folks on this call seem to have a great understanding of the scope of need. And we just heard so much about that from, some local perspectives, some statewide perspectives. By the last count, which thank you so much to Alan for pointing out that we cannot rely any longer on the federal survey that was keeping count of food insecurity in this country, the count that we have been relying on for the last 30 years to, base our policy off of. The scope is enormous. We had 47 million Americans that reported food insecurity. That was in the 2023 count. We can only imagine how the economic circumstances have increased that number today. Of course, of those 47 million reporting, only about 42 million are those that are receiving SNAP benefits at this time. And it is a scale beyond what really is imaginable, certainly to those of us who are doing this work in DC and doing our best to really amplify the voices of the folks on the ground. It is impossible to overstate how essential the federal intervention has been over the last 50 plus years with the creation and the maintenance of this program. We're just talking about SNAP, but of course we heard about WIC, about the National School Lunch Program, about summer EBT, about so many of the important developments that keep our folks fueled and fed. But we are absolutely, as we heard from our faith leaders here, in a moment of crisis. It's been an extended moment of crisis, since the start of this most recent administration, the start of this new Congress. We've really seen a contempt toward this program. I mean, the folks that are served, that is unlike anything I think we have experienced in the last few decades. So we can speak to more of the specifics of what some of the legislative and executive actions have looked like that have really had the greatest impact beyond just the immediate shutdown crisis that we found ourselves in this moment. But I do want to make sure that Andrew can introduce himself and his work as well here as one of fabulous partners.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sammy, and thank you, Lindsay. Thank you to the previous speakers as well. I'm Andrew Fuller. I'm the Program Director for Economic Policy, and I help chair some of our domestic work in the DC office for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. And for those of you who don't know, I actually work very closely with both Sammy and Lindsay. Sammy helps coordinate some of our interfaith efforts across denominations and religious groups on hunger issues, and Lindsay helps coordinate the housing groups as well. And we all work together on a really regular basis and really appreciate the partnership. I'm also originally from Ohio, Sammy, so we sort of bring this sort of rivalry in sports, but I can forgive you for the Michiganders background. I'll just throw out there, just to weigh in, all the introduction stuff has been absolutely correct. I just wanted to throw out there, since there's been a lot of mixed messaging and different things on the internet these days about like who people in SNAP really are. Some really good examples that I've heard over the last few weeks of just people who've shared their stories are working families with children. It's probably the fastest growing population of people experiencing food security. That is people who do not make enough to sort of basically afford food, but are working full time and have children at their disposal. Another group is seniors who have a fixed income. Maybe Social Security is not keeping up with the inflation of food across the country. Or maybe it's a person with disabilities, right? Who, disability does not pay that much and they need a little supplemental help with their food. These are the by large and shares, like the greatest people experiencing food security. And where faith groups often really come in great help is not to replace what SNAP does, but often to work in partnership and alongside. In any public program across history, across the world, there's always people who fall through the cracks, and we are often the best people because very few of us screen for incomes or other things like that. We just see people who need assistance and we give them food. So that's often the role that we've played in the past and do really, really well, but we cannot replace the whole system. And so an expression of our faith in serving people who are hungry in advocacy is one really key part of that. I'll also throw in there that and we can get into the work requirements and other things later, but as we're sort of looking to changes to SNAP, we are seeing a lot greater demand across the board for faith groups to be a bigger player. And so since we are being asked of these things by different officials, by different administration people, people of faith play a really pivotal role in sort of being the responders to this crisis. So happy to leave it there for now. Turn it back to you, Lindsay.
Yeah, thank you both so much for that. And you both kind of touched on the federal kind of responsibility, and it was touched on earlier as well. So just wondering if you guys can speak to why, even sort of outside of spending, why it's important for SNAP to not, the responsibility of SNAP to not fall completely to the states, even though, as Andrew mentioned, we've seen that changed kind of drastically in HR 1, and also kind of what is the status of things. I know that things are updating constantly, probably as we speak. But just wondering if there can be kind of a overview, big picture for those who may not be as in the loop.
Certainly, I can jump in right here. I want to offer just a very, very brief timeline of what kind of the last month or so has looked like. I'm sure everyone on this call is engaged enough to know that the crisis has been unfolding at a rapid clip, and you've been feeling it on the ground in your communities. But just really quickly, looking at the end of September, of course, the government shut down. SNAP benefits were able to continue temporarily through the end of October. But by mid-October, USDA, the Department of Agriculture, issued a notice to all state agencies directing them not to send their case issuance files on recipients to their EBT card processors for November. They cited an uncertainty in funding, despite the fact that they had their posted contingency plan that had additional reserves that should go to SNAP. But by around October 18th, the department had deleted that previous contingency plan from their website, and they had claimed that those funds could not be used to fully fund SNAP for November. So fast forward to the end of October, we saw the first of a few multi-state lawsuits that was filed against the administration. We saw governors sending a letter to the president asking him to fully fund SNAP for November. We saw district judges holding emergency hearings and all finding that the Department of Agriculture had the authority to use the contingency funds that were available to them. However, it was too little, too late, and we all know how that went come the start of this month in November, when SNAP benefits for the first time in the history of the program were not issued to participants. Since then, in the last week or two, we've seen several iterations of guidance come down from the Department of Agriculture, memos instructing states to issue partial benefits with varying calculations that they should use. Speaking of the many heroes that I'm sure are included on this call, our state administrators who are doing everything in their power to figure out how to rewire their systems to get even partial benefits out to folks while they awaited further instruction from the administration. We had, judges ordering the administration to fully fund November SNAP benefits, the Department of Justice stepping in to file an appeal, some states going on to submit their files. And then, we saw this go all the way to the Supreme Court, where the administration has sought a stay to kind of wait and see, what is to happen next. And of course, all of this action may ultimately be moot, because Lindsay, where we are right now, as folks may know, is that over the weekend a deal was reached on the Senate side to both extend a continuing resolution, extend the existing levels of funding for the full government through the end of January. And they've tacked on a few full year funding bills, one being the bill that funds the Department of Agriculture for the full upcoming year, that would include full funding for SNAP, for WIC, and for other anti-hunger programs that advocates care deeply about. So that would extend funding for those programs through the end of September 2026. Of course, this is very contentious, and we don't need to get into the politics of having to choose one basic needs program over another for low-income Americans who are suffering with a lot of their needs being unmet. But as far as we know, I mean, that bill passed in the Senate. It has now come over to the House side. And I think at least the three of us will certainly be probably watching our C-SPAN to see what is happening later tonight as the House takes up that measure. There is uncertainty, as much as we expect it to pass and the shutdown to ultimately conclude. We don't know yet exactly what is going to happen. The margins are so very tight. And even when the shutdown concludes, we don't know exactly what that means for the timeline for each individual state on issuing the remaining benefits that need to go out the door to beneficiaries, and of course to help the folks who were working to enroll in these programs, especially those who became newly eligible over the last few weeks to seek their benefits themselves. So I will pause there. That's just really kind of what the last couple weeks of life have looked like from the federal perspective.
Yeah, I think actually Sammy covered most of it. So I'll just add that C-SPAN right now, the House did gavel and they're expected to vote tonight, but whether it passes or not, it's not clear yet. Should the government pass a spending bill and reopen the government, in that eventuality, it is not clear of what the impact will be in terms of delays, but because SNAP benefits are administered by states, it could look very different depending on where you live in terms of the timeline, because every system is a little different. So we'll be looking forward to more guidance as we get more details about that. I will say though that this shutdown actually overcame what Lindsay hinted at before in terms of states putting on greater responsibility, because November 1st was a deadline by USDA to implement new work requirements for many, and some states chose to opt in to sort of start those work requirements, expanded work requirements even earlier. So that would sort of put greater burden on states to sort of screen out people, including more vulnerable populations. And further down the line, we could be seeing states needing to pay a greater cost share into SNAP, which they can really not afford. I don't know many states who can afford a few $1 million out of their budget every year, much less billions of dollars. Next year, they're expected to pay a greater share of the administration of SNAP. And then in the following year, depending on their error rate, they might have to pay a greater share of the actual benefit cost to individuals. It could be so severe that lower income states might be at risk of needing to drop out of the program if things are not fixed well. So we're monitoring those situations, but this is why state advocacy also is going to be important, as people are making really critical of state budget decisions about how they try to fund that program, because maybe they fully fund the SNAP benefits, but other things will need to be cut to compensate for that. I'll leave it there for now. If you want to, since we're getting a little close on.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you to you both. I will open it up for questions now. I'll turn it back over to Alan so he can facilitate this portion. But thank you all both. Thank you both so much for kind of giving us that background.
Thanks, Lindsay, and to the three of you and our other ecumenical and interfaith partners, in DC that are engaging on this. I want attendees to know how much hard work they're also putting into this. It is a very different type of conversation than what we heard about in the on the ground ministries, but hopefully still quite closely connected. And the lessons, the information, the stories that our churches have, our faith groups have from the ground actually inform the work connecting with legislators here in DC, in state legislatures with governors. There are all sorts of different sort of pressure points to turn to. I want to thank you all for your questions. I want to simplify them to two, given we have 5 minutes left. One on advocacy, one on hearts and minds. In short, does advocacy matter? Does it matter that we reach out to elected officials? And what are some recommendations on how to best do that?
Well,
I will just, yeah, I will just jump in to say that, of course, it matters. These are the folks that have the power to make a lot of the large scale changes that we want to see. We hope that our work is a microcosm on the ground of what we can accomplish when we have the full force, especially of the federal government behind us. What we heard from all these fabulous faith leaders on the ground is that it cannot be done despite their most Herculean efforts. We absolutely need the federal government to take responsibility for the economic situation that plagues so many low-income American families, and we cannot outrun it without their help. So I'll leave it there.
they're completely right. And I would say that we have the opportunity to do advocacy at several levels. One is certainly to write and call and share the direct experiences we're seeing on the ground with our elected representatives at every level. The second is to build relationships with key people beyond one call or one letter to make sure that we are able to work together. And as folks of both parties are addressing these questions, they call us because they see us as key leaders in the community. And that's happening, I know, in New York and around the country.
I would also add, in addition to advocacy with your representatives in Congress, senators, et cetera, and folks in the state, folks in your city, wherever you've got, if you discover that those people are unresponsive, next year things might change. Find a candidate who will do the work that you want them to do. Find some friends who want that, and get involved.
I'll throw in there that if you ask any like legislative staffer and even some members of Congress that question, they would shake you and say yes, 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 yes. I'll also say, by the way, say this government funding fight gets resolved. Commenting even when an issue is out of the news actually is almost the more important time to sort of reach out, right? So sometimes people say like, oh, it was just in the headlines, and then like people stop commenting on it. It must not have been that important, and people will forget about election season. But if people are messaging consistently and regularly and persistently over an issue over a long period of time, that's a signal to a member that that's an issue that they should worry about. So I would say, I'm one of those people who go like, oh, well, I don't really want to bother my lawmaker. Like they're busy as it is. Be persistent, and it really does make an impact the more time you put into it.
Yep, absolutely, absolutely. The only thing I'll add here is expressing gratitude when elected officials do something that you do like that is helpful for this. For the staffer that receives that message, for them passing it along to the elected official, that carries some significant power. These are, despite certain widespread frustrations with elected officials, I do think there are many hardworking people who do try to resolve some of these challenges. in our communities, and thanking them for those efforts really does go a long way, and can help them, Andrew, to your point of sort of the momentum, it can help them with that momentum aspect as well. Knowing we're running right up at time, just one last question here. I think that hints at a couple of the questions we've received. Are folks who are frustrated by those who may be misinformed, they may have incomplete information, they may just simply have different perspectives on how we should respond to hunger and need. What are a couple of tips on changing hearts and minds to get more people involved or engaged in this work?
I'll start and I'll say, show up, get to work, let people show you at work what you and your community are doing when you are at work doing, feeding people, getting to know your neighbors, be that good example. Sure, people might want to talk to you and change your mind, and you can say, I can engage you, but I have a lot of work to do and I'd like to bring you along with me.
My response is simply preach the gospel. It's very simple. This isn't us, this is Jesus. This is Jesus.
And I'll just jump in to add, you don't plant a tree, you plant a seed. So